I'm Marcus Rivera, 28 years old, and according to my family, I'm the disappointment who can't seem to get his life together. When my sister Jessica called about her engagement celebration last week, her voice carried that familiar tone of obligation mixed with embarrassment. "Marcus, you should probably come," she said, pausing just long enough to make her next words sting. "But maybe don't mention whatever it is you're doing for work these days. Brad's family will be there, and they're very traditional." What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their so-called failure had just spent 3 months in Belgrade, dismantling a human trafficking network that had been operating for over a decade. While they saw someone who couldn't hold down a steady job, the truth was that I held one of the most classified positions in American intelligence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air in Westfield, Connecticut, carried the scent of burning leaves and old money. I gripped the steering wheel of my beat-up Toyota Camry, watching the manicured lawns of Maple Ridge Estates roll past my window like a parade of perfection I'd never quite been invited to join. The contrast between this world and where I'd been just 72 hours ago was almost surreal. 3 days earlier, I was in a cramped surveillance van in Eastern Europe, tracking arms dealers through the narrow streets of a city most Americans couldn't pronounce. Now I was navigating the familiar territory of my childhood shame. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Use the side entrance. Valet parking is reserved for the Whitman family and close friends." Even her messages carried the weight of disappointment. I wasn't close family, apparently. I was just Marcus, the son who'd somehow lost his way after college. The one who embarrassed them at cocktail parties when people asked what their children were doing with their lives. The Westfield Country Club loomed ahead, its white columns and manicured gardens, a testament to the kind of success my family understood and valued. I pulled into the overflow parking area, a gravel lot hidden behind perfectly trimmed hedges where the help and the less distinguished guests were expected to leave their vehicles. The women wore designer dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, their jewelry catching the light like tiny captured stars. The men spoke in the confident tones of people who'd never had to worry about making rent or choosing between groceries and gas. I spotted my parents immediately. My father stood near the bar, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my car. He was deep in conversation with Senator Robert Hayes, their body language suggesting the kind of casual intimacy that comes from decades of political donations and mutual favors. My mother held court near the French doors that led to the terrace, resplendent in a cream-colored St. John's suit that screamed understated elegance. She was introducing Jessica and Brad to a group of older couples, her smile radiant, with the joy of a mother whose daughter had exceeded every expectation. Neither of them noticed me enter. I wasn't surprised. Over the years, I'd become something of a ghost in their world. Present, but not quite visible. Acknowledged, but not celebrated. I made my way to the gift table, where an elaborate display of wrapped boxes and envelopes created a small mountain of congratulations. I placed my modest contribution among the offerings from Tiffany and Cartier, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the simple card I'd chosen from a drugstore in Hartford. "Marcus!" Jessica's voice cut through the ambient conversation, bright and artificially enthusiastic. She glided toward me in a flowing silk dress, her engagement ring catching the light like a small solar system orbiting her finger. The smile on her face was the kind she'd perfected for networking events, warm enough to seem genuine but calculated enough to maintain distance. "I'm so glad you could make it." She embraced me briefly, the kind of hug that looked affectionate from a distance but felt more like a diplomatic gesture up close. As she pulled back, her eyes quickly scanned my outfit, a simple navy suit that I'd bought off the rack 3 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but it clearly wasn't bespoke, and her expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment before the smile returned. "Come meet Brad's parents," she said, taking my arm and guiding me toward a distinguished-looking couple near the terrace doors. "Charles and Victoria Whitman, this is my brother Marcus. Marcus does consulting work in security." The way she said consulting work made it sound like a euphemism for unemployment, and I saw Charles Whitman's expression shift slightly, the polite interest of someone trying to place my profession in his mental hierarchy of respectable careers. Security consulting, Charles repeated, his handshake firm but brief. That's interesting. What kind of businesses do you work with? His tone suggested he was asking more out of politeness than genuine curiosity, and I could see him already preparing to move on to more promising conversational territory. Various types, I replied, keeping my answer deliberately vague. Risk assessment, threat evaluation, that sort of thing. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did assess risks and evaluate threats, just not for the kind of businesses he was imagining. The human trafficking ring we'd dismantled in Belgrade had been financing terrorist operations across 3 continents, but I couldn't exactly share that information at a cocktail party. Victoria Whitman smiled the kind of smile people use when they're not quite sure what to make of you. How fascinating, she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. Brad works in alternative investments. Perhaps you two should chat. Before I could respond, she'd already turned her attention to someone else, and Charles had followed her lead, leaving me standing with Jessica and Brad. Brad Whitman was everything my parents had hoped I would become. Tall, confident, expensively educated, and blessed with the kind of easy charm that came from a lifetime of having doors opened for him. He extended his hand with a politician's enthusiasm, his smile bright and apparently genuine. Marcus, great to finally meet you. Jess has told me so much about you. I wondered what exactly she'd told him, given that she knew virtually nothing about my actual life. Congratulations on the engagement, I said, meaning it despite everything. Whatever else might be true, Jessica seemed happy, and that counted for something. When's the wedding? Next spring, Brad replied, his arm sliding around Jessica's waist with practiced ease. We're thinking somewhere in the Hamptons. Victoria has connections with some amazing venues. He spoke about his future with the confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder whether his plans would work out, never had to question whether he was worthy of his own dreams. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, touching on safe topics like the weather and the upcoming holidays. I could feel Jessica's subtle management of the interaction, the way she steered the discussion away from anything that might require me to explain my life in detail. When Brad mentioned his work at the hedge fund, talking about emerging markets and currency fluctuations with the casual expertise of someone who moved millions of dollars with a phone call, I found myself thinking about the briefing documents I'd been studying just days before. Information about money laundering operations that used exactly the kind of complex financial instruments Brad traded every day. My mother appeared at my elbow like a force of nature disguised as elegant hospitality. Marcus, darling, she said, her voice carrying the perfect blend of maternal warmth and subtle correction. I'm so glad you're here. She kissed my cheek, and for a moment I caught a whiff of her perfume, something French and expensive that had been her signature scent for as long as I could remember. You remember Senator Hayes, don't you? He's been asking about you. I doubted that was true, but I allowed myself to be guided toward the bar where my father and the senator were still deep in conversation. Senator Hayes was a fixture in Connecticut politics, a moderate Republican whose influence extended far beyond the state's borders. He'd been to our house for dinner countless times over the years, and his daughter had been Jessica's roommate at Yale. In my parents' world, these connections mattered more than almost anything else. Marcus, my father said as we approached, his voice carrying the tone he used for introductions that required careful handling. Senator, you remember my son. He's in the security business now. The word now carried weight, suggesting a series of previous careers that hadn't quite worked out, a pattern of false starts and failed attempts at finding his place in the world. Senator Hayes shook my hand with the kind of grip that politicians perfect over decades of meeting constituents. Security? That's a growing field, he said, and I could see him trying to place me in some recognizable category. Corporate security? Personal protection? His questions felt like a gentle interrogation, the kind of polite fact-finding mission that people in his position conducted automatically. A bit of both, I replied, sticking to the script I'd developed over the years. Risk assessment mainly, helping businesses understand potential vulnerabilities. It was true enough if you expanded the definition of, quote, businesses to include democratic governments and, quote, vulnerabilities to include existential threats to national security. The conversation drifted toward safer territory, with my father and the senator discussing recent legislation and its potential impact on various industries. I found myself serving as a mostly silent audience to their exchange, occasionally nodding or offering a brief comment when directly addressed. This was familiar territory, the role I'd learned to play at family gatherings over the years. Present but not prominent, acknowledged but not celebrated. As the evening progressed, I watched the easy interactions between the other guests, the way they moved through conversations with shared references and common experiences. They spoke about vacation homes in Aspen and children at prep schools, about charity galas and country club memberships. It was a world with its own language and customs, a place where success was measured by visible achievements and social connections. I found myself thinking about my real life, the one that existed in shadows and classified briefings. 3 months ago, I'd been part of a joint task force tracking a network that was moving weapons and people across half a dozen countries. We'd worked 18-hour days in cramped safe houses, surviving on cold coffee and determination. The operation had ended with simultaneous raids in 4 different cities, liberating over 200 victims, and dismantling an organization that had been operating for more than a decade. There had been no ceremony, no public recognition, no newspaper headlines announcing our success. The debriefing had taken place in a windowless room at Langley, with a handful of people whose names would never appear in any official record. Director Amanda Cross had shaken my hand and told me that the work we'd done would save countless lives, but that information would never leave that room. To the world, and especially to my family, those 3 months simply didn't exist. The disconnect between these two realities felt particularly sharp in this setting, surrounded by people celebrating achievements that would be photographed and announced in society pages. Jessica's engagement would be written up in the Hartford Courant and the Connecticut Magazine. There would be pictures of the happy couple, mentions of their prestigious educations and successful careers. Their wedding would be covered in similar fashion, a public celebration of private success. Meanwhile, the most important work of my life would remain forever invisible, known only to a small circle of people who understood the true cost of keeping the world safe. The families of the victims we'd rescued would never know my name. The terrorist plots we'd prevented would never make headlines because they'd never had the chance to unfold. Success in my world was measured by what didn't happen, by catastrophes averted and lives saved in secret. As the evening wound down, guests began filtering out onto the terrace for the formal toasts. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, creating a picture-perfect backdrop for the celebration. Jessica and Brad stood together near the edge of the terrace, their faces glowing with happiness and champagne. My parents flanked them like proud sentries, their expressions radiating satisfaction with a plan perfectly executed. Charles Whitman raised his glass and spoke about the merger of 2 great families, about the bright future that lay ahead for the happy couple. He mentioned Harvard and Goldman Sachs, talked about success and achievement in terms that everyone present understood and appreciated. The applause was warm and genuine, the kind of approval that comes easily when everything fits into recognized patterns of accomplishment. My father followed with his own toast, speaking about Jessica's exceptional character and remarkable achievements. He talked about watching her grow from a determined little girl into a successful young woman who exemplified everything the Rivera family stood for. His words were loving and proud, and I found myself genuinely happy for Jessica, despite the implicit comparison to my own apparent lack of direction. As the formal portion of the evening concluded and guests began to drift toward their cars, I found myself standing alone near the edge of the terrace. The country club's grounds stretched out below me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Perfectly manicured lawns and gardens that represented everything my family valued about success and respectability. It was beautiful in its way, a testament to human achievement and the rewards that came with playing by accepted rules. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at it all from the outside, like a visitor from another world who spoke the language but would never truly belong. The gap between their reality and mine felt unbridgeable, a chasm created not by choice, but by necessity. They lived in the light, celebrated and acknowledged, while I existed in shadows that were both my protection and my prison. My mother appeared beside me, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "It was a lovely evening," she said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied. Jessica looked beautiful, didn't she? I agreed that she had, because it was true, and because it was easier than exploring the complicated emotions swirling beneath the surface of the evening's festivities. Marcus, she continued, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when approaching difficult subjects. Your father and I have been talking. We're worried about you. The words landed with familiar weight, another installment in a conversation we'd been having in various forms for years. You're 28 years old, and you don't seem to have any clear direction. These consulting jobs, whatever they are, they're not building toward anything permanent. I wanted to tell her about the commendation letter from the Secretary of Defense that sat in a classified file somewhere in Washington. I wanted to explain that my work had contributed to international security agreements that would protect American interests for decades to come. Instead, I offered the same vague reassurances I'd been giving for years, promises that I was working towards something more stable and conventional. The drive home to my apartment in Hartford felt longer than usual. The distance between Westfield and my neighborhood measured in more than miles. My building was a converted warehouse in a part of the city that was slowly gentrifying, the kind of place where young professionals lived while they saved money for something better. To my family, it represented everything that was wrong with my choices, a symbol of my failure to achieve the kind of success they understood and valued. My apartment was sparse but comfortable, furnished with pieces I'd collected over the years from various postings and assignments. The most valuable item was a secure communications system, disguised as an entertainment center, a piece of technology that connected me to a network spanning the globe. As I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair, I reflected on the evening's events and the familiar weight of living a double life. Tomorrow, I would return to my real work, to briefings and analysis and the constant vigilance required to stay ahead of threats that most people couldn't imagine. The human trafficking network we'd dismantled was just one piece of a larger puzzle, part of a shadow economy that funded terrorism and destabilized regions across the world. The work was dangerous and demanding, but it was also meaningful in ways that Jessica's engagement celebration, for all its beauty and joy, could never be. But tonight, sitting alone in my apartment with the taste of champagne still on my lips and the echo of polite conversations still ringing in my ears, I felt the familiar ache of isolation that came with this life I'd chosen. My family's love was real, but it was conditional on a version of myself that didn't exist. Their disappointment was equally real, born from expectations I could never meet, because they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was trying to accomplish. The phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, sent from what was probably the back seat of a limousine heading toward some after-party I hadn't been invited to attend. Thanks for coming tonight. It meant a lot to have you there. The message was kind and probably sincere, but it also felt like a summary of my role in the family, someone whose presence was appreciated, but whose absence wouldn't fundamentally change anything. I finished my wine and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve a mission larger than myself. The work gave my life meaning and purpose, even if that purpose had to remain hidden from the people who mattered most to me. It was a trade-off I'd accepted long ago, but some nights, like this one, the cost felt particularly heavy. The call came at 6 a.m, 3 weeks after Jessica's engagement party. I was already awake, going through my morning routine of checking encrypted communications and reviewing intelligence briefings from overnight operations in different time zones. The number on my phone showed my mother's contact information, but Patricia Rivera never called this early unless something was wrong. Marcus. Her voice was crisp and businesslike, the tone she used when discussing real estate deals or coordinating family logistics. I need you to clear your schedule for this Saturday evening. We're hosting a celebration dinner for Jessica and Brad, and your presence is required. The word required hung in the air with all the weight of a military order, though I doubted she realized the irony. I set down my coffee mug, a simple ceramic piece I'd picked up at a market in Prague during a surveillance operation 2 years ago. What kind of celebration? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. My parents never did anything halfway, and Jessica's engagement represented the kind of achievement they felt compelled to showcase properly. Brad's promotion, she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. He's been made a senior partner at Whitman Capital, the youngest in the firm's history. Charles and Victoria are hosting a gathering at their estate in Greenwich, and naturally, we've been invited as family. It's important that we present ourselves appropriately. The emphasis on appropriately was unmistakable. This wasn't a casual family dinner, but a performance, an opportunity for the Rivera family to demonstrate their worthiness of association with the Whitman dynasty. My role in this performance had apparently been predetermined, though I hadn't been consulted about the script. "Who else will be there?" I asked, already calculating the security implications of a gathering that would likely include several high-profile political and business figures. It was an occupational hazard of my real job that I couldn't attend social events without automatically assessing potential threats and vulnerabilities. "The guest list is quite impressive," Patricia continued, her voice warming with the pleasure of name-dropping. "Senator Hayes and his wife, of course. The Ashfords, from Ashford Industries. Judge Morrison and her husband. Some of Brad's colleagues from the financial sector. It's exactly the kind of networking opportunity that could benefit your career if you handle it properly." There it was, the assumption that my career needed benefiting, that I was somehow deficient in professional accomplishments and social connections. If only she knew that my security clearance was higher than Senator Hayes, or that I'd briefed congressional committees on threats they'd never heard of in their classified sessions. "What time should I be there?" I asked, accepting the inevitable. There was no reasonable way to decline without creating a family crisis that would ultimately require more energy to manage than simply attending the event. "Cocktails begin at 7, dinner at 8:30. And Marcus," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "please dress appropriately. This isn't one of your casual consulting meetings. These are serious people with serious expectations." After ending the call, I returned to my morning briefing materials, but found it difficult to concentrate on intelligence reports about arms trafficking in the Balkans, when my mind was occupied with the prospect of another evening spent managing my family's disappointment. The challenge of maintaining my cover story became exponentially more difficult at events like this, where successful people gathered to celebrate success in ways that were completely foreign to my actual experience. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would be attending a party full of people who wielded various forms of power and influence, while possessing a level of classified access that exceeded most of theirs. The work I did affected global security and international relations, but it was work that could never be acknowledged or celebrated in the way that Brad's promotion would be toasted and applauded. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from Agent Daniel Walsh, my former training supervisor, who had become something of an unofficial mentor over the years. Dan had retired from active service but maintained consulting relationships with the agency, and we'd developed a friendship based on our shared understanding of the unique pressures that came with this life. "Heard you wrapped up the Belgrade operation successfully. Outstanding work. Coffee this week when you're back in town?" The message was brief but carried the weight of professional recognition from someone whose opinion actually mattered. Dan understood the significance of dismantling a human trafficking network in ways that my family never could, and his acknowledgement meant more than any toast at a Greenwich mansion ever would. I spent the next several days immersed in debriefings and analysis work, helping to process the intelligence gathered during the Belgrade operation and identify potential connections to other criminal organizations. The scope of what we'd uncovered was staggering, revealing networks that stretched across continents and involved players at the highest levels of organized crime and terrorism. The victims we'd rescued represented just a fraction of the people caught up in these systems. But each rescue was a life saved, a family reunited, a small victory against forces that most people couldn't imagine. The work was exhausting and often depressing, but it was also profoundly meaningful in ways that made the superficial concerns of my family's social world feel almost absurd. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Greenwich Estates look like something out of a magazine spread. The Whitman property was a testament to generations of accumulated wealth, a sprawling colonial mansion set on 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. As I drove through the gates, I passed a small army of valets and security personnel, their presence a reminder that events like this attracted people who needed protection from the complexities of the modern world. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray suit that was expensive enough to pass inspection but not so flashy as to draw attention. The goal was to blend in sufficiently to avoid embarrassing my family while maintaining enough authenticity to preserve my own sense of self. It was a delicate balance that I'd been perfecting for years, though it never became easier. The valet who took my keys was polite but professionally dismissive, the kind of trained invisibility that expensive service required. As I walked toward the main entrance, I could see other guests arriving in cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The contrast between this world and the one I inhabited professionally was stark, though both operated on principles of discretion and exclusive access. Charles Whitman greeted guests at the front door with the easy confidence of someone born to host gatherings like this. He was everything my father aspired to be. Old money personified with the kind of effortless authority that came from never having to question your place in the world. His handshake was firm and his smile genuine, though his eyes carried the practiced assessment of someone who cataloged social value automatically. "Marcus, delighted you could join us," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem personal while maintaining the proper distance for someone of uncertain social standing. "Your parents are already here, and Jessica and Brad are holding court in the library. Please, make yourself comfortable." The interior of the Whitman estate was a masterclass in understated luxury, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it was so thoroughly established. Original oil paintings lined the walls, antique furniture-filled rooms that could have doubled as museum galleries, and Persian rugs covered hardwood floors that probably cost more than my annual salary. I found my family in the library, a room that managed to be both impressive and comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather furniture arranged around a massive fireplace. Jessica looked radiant in a navy dress that complemented her engagement ring, while Brad wore the confident smile of someone celebrating a significant career milestone. My parents flanked them like proud generals, surveying a successful campaign. "Marcus!" Jessica's greeting was warm but carried the subtle management I'd come to expect at events like this. "I'm so glad you could make it. Brad was just telling everyone about his new position. Isn't it exciting?" Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, and I found myself genuinely happy for her success, even as I recognized the performance aspects of family gatherings like this. Brad shook my hand with the enthusiasm of someone riding high on professional achievement. "Marcus, good to see you again. Your sister tells me you're in security consulting. That must be interesting work." His interest seemed more genuine than it had at the engagement party, possibly because his recent promotion had put him in a generous mood. "It has its moments," I replied, sticking to my standard response. "Congratulations on the partnership. Senior partner at your age is quite an accomplishment." This was true, and Brad's success was legitimately impressive within the context of his chosen field, even if it operated in a completely different universe from my own professional reality. The conversation flowed easily for several minutes, touching on Brad's new responsibilities and Jessica's own career developments at Goldman Sachs. They spoke about their upcoming wedding plans and the house hunting process in Greenwich, their future unfolding with the kind of predictable prosperity that came from playing by established rules and exceeding established expectations. Senator Hayes approached our group with the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent decades working rooms full of influential people. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand, "good to see you again. Your father tells me you're doing well in the security field. That's a growth industry these days, isn't it?" The senator's interest felt more substantive than casual small talk, and I wondered if my father had oversold my professional achievements in an attempt to make me seem more successful than the family narrative usually allowed. "There's definitely demand for risk assessment and threat evaluation," I agreed, which was true enough without being specific about the types of threats I actually evaluated. "I imagine you work with a lot of corporate clients," Senator Hayes continued, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation. "The cybersecurity component must be significant these days. We're seeing a lot of concern about that in Washington." His comment touched on areas where my real expertise intersected with public policy, and I had to be careful not to reveal knowledge that would be difficult to explain within my cover story. "Technology definitely creates new vulnerabilities," I said, keeping my response general enough to avoid raising questions about the source of my information. The dinner bell chimed before the conversation could develop further, and we moved into the dining room where Charles Whitman had arranged a seating plan that reflected both social hierarchy and strategic networking opportunities. I found myself positioned between Judge Morrison's husband, a retired appellate court justice, and Sarah Ashford, whose family's manufacturing empire had been built over 3 generations. The dinner conversation ranged across topics that revealed the interests and concerns of people who operated at high levels of American society. There was discussion of recent Supreme Court decisions, analysis of Federal Reserve policy, and speculation about upcoming elections. These were people who understood how systems worked because they were part of the system's participants rather than observers in the mechanisms that shaped national policy. Judge Morrison's husband proved to be an engaging conversationalist with a deep knowledge of constitutional law and its practical applications. Our discussion of Fourth Amendment issues in the digital age touched on areas where my professional experience provided insights I couldn't share, creating the familiar challenge of seeming knowledgeable without revealing the source of my knowledge. Sarah Ashford spoke intelligently about international trade policy and its impact on manufacturing, her perspective shaped by decades of managing supply chains that spanned multiple continents. Her concerns about regional stability in Eastern Europe came uncomfortably close to areas where I'd been operationally involved, requiring careful navigation to avoid raising questions about my interest in geopolitical developments. Throughout dinner, I watched my family's performance with a mixture of admiration and sadness. My father discussed complex legal cases with the authority of someone who'd spent decades mastering his profession. My mother charmed the other wives with stories about high-end real estate deals and the celebrities who'd purchased Connecticut estates through her firm. Jessica and Brad glowed with the confidence of a young couple whose success seemed assured by talent, timing, and advantageous connections. They were genuinely accomplished people who'd earned their places at this table through hard work and intelligence. Their success wasn't accidental or undeserved, and their pride in their achievements was entirely justified. The tragedy from my perspective was that they couldn't recognize accomplishment that didn't fit their established categories of success and failure. During the main course, Charles Whitman stood to offer a toast celebrating Brad's promotion and the broader success of the younger generation represented at the table. He spoke about the importance of maintaining standards and traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, about the responsibility that came with privilege, and the obligation to use success in service of larger purposes. His words were thoughtful and sincere, reflecting genuine values rather than empty platitudes. As I listened to him speak about service and responsibility, I found myself thinking about the different ways those concepts could be interpreted and applied. His vision of service involved charitable foundations and civic leadership, participation in institutions that shaped policy and influenced outcomes through established channels. My version of service involved classified operations and covert actions, work that protected the very stability that allowed institutions like these to function. We were both serving larger purposes, but in ways so different that they might as well have been separate species of civic engagement. The evening's entertainment moved to the sitting room after dinner, where smaller groups formed around different conversation topics. I found myself drawn into a discussion about international business conditions with several of Brad's colleagues from the financial sector. Their perspective on global markets was sophisticated and well-informed, shaped by daily involvement in transactions that moved billions of dollars across national boundaries. One of the hedge fund managers mentioned recent volatility in Eastern European currencies, attributing it to, quote, political uncertainty and infrastructure concerns. His analysis was accurate as far as it went, but incomplete in ways that reflected the limitations of public information. The infrastructure concerns he referenced were actually the result of the trafficking network we'd dismantled, operations that had used legitimate business channels to move money and resources across borders. I listened to their analysis with the strange experience of hearing partial truths presented as complete pictures, understanding that they were working with the information available to them while remaining unaware of the hidden factors that shaped the markets they traded in daily. It was a reminder of how much of the world's complexity remained invisible to even sophisticated observers who lacked classified access. As the evening wound down, guests began making their departures with the kind of gracious efficiency that characterized gatherings of busy, important people. There were promises to stay in touch, invitations to future events, and the subtle networking that maintained the social connections these relationships required. I observed the ritual with the anthropological interest of someone studying a culture he understood but didn't quite belong to. My parents approached as I was preparing to leave, their expressions suggesting they wanted to debrief the evening's events. "That went well," my father said, his tone carrying approval that felt conditional and temporary. "You handled yourself appropriately. Senator Hayes seemed impressed with your knowledge of security issues. Charles mentioned that there might be opportunities in their organization for someone with your background," my mother added, her voice brightening with the possibility of a connection that could lead to more conventional success. "He's planning to expand their corporate security division, and they're looking for experienced consultants." The offer was probably genuine and potentially lucrative, but it represented everything I'd been trying to avoid in my professional life. Corporate security work would provide the kind of visible, explainable career that my family could understand and celebrate, but it would also mean abandoning the mission that gave my life its deeper meaning. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, giving them the non-committal response they'd learned to expect from me over the years. "It was a lovely evening. Thank you for including me." As I drove home through the quiet streets of Greenwich, past estates that housed some of the most powerful people in America, I reflected on the strange duality of my existence. In a few hours, I would return to briefings about terrorist financing and weapons trafficking, to work that directly affected the security of the nation and the stability of the international system. But tonight, I'd been the family disappointment who needed career guidance, the son whose achievements were so minimal that a corporate security position represented a significant step up. The disconnect between these realities created a cognitive dissonance that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, a psychological pressure that had no outlet, because my real life had to remain secret. The lights of Hartford appeared ahead, a smaller city that felt more authentic than the rarefied world I'd just left behind. My apartment building looked humble after an evening in Greenwich, but it also felt honest in ways that mattered more than impressive architecture or expensive furniture. This was where I actually lived, in the space between worlds, serving purposes that couldn't be acknowledged in the places where acknowledgement mattered most to the people I loved. My secure phone showed several missed messages from colleagues at Langley, updates on developing situations that would require my attention in the morning. The work continued around the clock, across time zones and international boundaries, a constant vigilance that most people never saw or appreciated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the mission that defined my professional identity, even as my personal identity remained fractured between the truth I couldn't share and the fiction I had to maintain. The evening had been successful by my family's standards, another step in the careful cultivation of relationships and reputation that their world required. But it had also been a reminder of the price I paid for the life I'd chosen. The isolation that came from being unable to share my real achievements with the people whose approval I'd spent a lifetime seeking. It was a trade-off I'd accepted consciously. But some nights, like this one, the cost felt particularly heavy. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair with the latest intelligence briefings, transitioning back into the world where my expertise was valued and my contributions mattered. The work was important and necessary, but it was also lonely in ways that family gatherings only emphasized. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new purpose. But tonight I sat alone with the weight of secrets that couldn't be shared and achievements that couldn't be celebrated in the places where celebration would mean the most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.